And imagine if someone else were in Moses' shoes, they might have said, yeah, I could walk all the way to Egypt, or you could just free them using your magic, right, Lord? So obviously he didn't say that, thank God. But if God can speak through a burning bush, can't he free the Israelites himself? Of course he can. This is the beautiful thing about ministry, about the kingdom of God, that he calls us to do very difficult things. He invites us to be a part of his mission, a part of his work. And Moses wouldn't have been someone you would say qualified. He was not a leader. He didn't want to speak in front of groups. He was very self-conscious about the way he spoke. So he was the last person that wanted to do this, but eventually we know he humbly submitted and let God use him. Now, in the next slide, you're going to see someone else, naive young boy. This is me on my first mission trip to the Philippines over 16 years ago, back when I was in university. And I'm going to be honest, the first time I traveled to the Philippines, I was not in a good place. I was really struggling. I was struggling mentally. I was destroying my body and my mind with stress and severe anxiety. And at that time in my life, in second year university, it's not pleasant to share this or pleasant to hear it, but I developed something called stress vomiting. So it became normal for me, at least to myself it seemed that this was my norm, that before I had an exam, anytime it was exam season, I would throw up and then I would go and ace the exam. And that was the routine that I would go through every time. And I hid the fact that I was throwing up because of stress, I hid it from my family, my parents, my friends, even my roommate in the dorm. I hid it from everyone because I thought, who could possibly understand? There's no one in the world that can relate to me. Are people going to think I'm bulimic? They're not going to understand this boy who's throwing up because of stress. Now, of course, in hindsight, I know that many people can relate to that. There's many people that have had that condition. A lot of people can relate. But in that time, I felt so alone, and I hid it from everyone. I knew that this was very unhealthy. And I remember specifically one day walking through the halls of our university, and I bumped into a friend, and I didn't go into details. I didn't tell him about the vomiting, any of those details, but I told him, I remember saying the words, "Today is the lowest moment of my life. This is the worst day of my life." Have you ever said those words to someone? Or have you ever even thought those words just to yourself? It's a hard thing to admit, to recognize this is the lowest point in my life. But I said that, and what my friend did is actually the best thing they could have done. They could have given me advice. They could have said, "Oh, you need to do this is what you should do." Or they could have said, "Everything's going to be all right, you're going to be just fine, you're going to get through it." But most of us know those words in that moment don't always help, right? But what my friend said is, "I don't know what to say. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist. I don't know what to say to help you or encourage you, but I'm here. I'm just going to be present with you." And they had exams. It's the middle of exam season. They should be busy. They sat with me for an hour. They said, "You don't need to say anything. I'll just sit with you." And that was so encouraging. That's why I never forget that exact moment. And I'm so thankful that they did that. It was more than what they could have done with words and advice. It was truly helpful. And then I knew I needed a change after I finished second year university. I didn't want to drop out of school. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to stop and take a whole year off. But I knew I needed to make a change. And I would have loved to tell all of you that when I went to the Philippines, my only motivation was to follow the Lord and to help children. That I want to be the hero, that I want to say that that was the only reason I went. But deep down, I know that part of me was running away from my problems. Yes, I wanted to go. I wanted to help children. But that first mission trip, when I look back on it, I realize, why the Philippines? One of my friends told me about the charity in the Philippines, and I said, "The Philippines? Where is that on the map?" "Well, it's on the complete other side of the globe. There's no further point on the globe. It's a 12-hour time difference. Midnight here is noon there." That was enticing to me. Yes, he showed me pictures of the children suffering and struggling. That was enticing. I wanted to help. But I also wanted to get away. And the good thing is, Instead of dropping out of school, I said, I'll just do a few weeks. I went on a mission trip without a team. It was so last minute, just myself for 3 weeks. And that mission trip was like shock therapy for me. Now, I don't want to say that everyone with anxiety needs to go to the Philippines. Some people need a doctor, some people need medication, sometimes it's a chemical imbalance. But for me personally, it was a perspective shift that I needed. Medication and seeing a doctor, all those things are great things. But it was like shock therapy in that I met children that here I am, stressed out about university, and these are children that would dream and pray to be able to go to kindergarten or grade 1 in a public school. But again, they couldn't afford the uniforms. Filipinos start counting with their pinky, so I'm used to it. They couldn't afford the uniforms. They couldn't afford the public transportation. They couldn't afford school supplies. They couldn't afford lunch money. They were embarrassed to go to school. So they weren't going to school. And they were scavenging with their parents, or working, or begging in the streets. And these are kids with families. I'm not just talking about orphaned, runaway children. Kids with families in slums. And that really broke my heart. I went back to Ontario, went back to the University of Waterloo. I added more on my plate. I started volunteering in the nursery at my church. I became a youth leader at church, added all these volunteer things, and I actually became less stressed. Again, everyone's different. I'm not saying that's what you need to do when you're stressed. Just add more to your schedule. No. But it was for me, I had this perspective shift for me personally. And so I stopped looking so inward myself. I believe that all the stress and anxiety I was putting on myself. I'd never blamed my parents or blamed anyone else. No one really put the pressure on me. But when I started realizing there were children on the other side of the world that couldn't even go to school, my perspective broadened. And I kept going back to the Philippines every summer until I finished university, and then I moved there permanently to become a full-time missionary. Now, in the Philippines, living in the Philippines, it's been home for the last 14 years for me now. I've witnessed so much pain and suffering and death face-to-face in the Philippines, more than I'd ever seen here in Canada. Now, in Canada, pain and suffering and death are all here, of course. These are universal struggles that we all face. I wish we didn't have to, but the reality is we are all going to come face-to-face with pain, suffering, and death. It's a part of life, regardless of your socioeconomic status, race, culture, but it does look different, and we face it in different ways. The pain and suffering I saw in Canada seemed to be more behind closed doors. It's only more in recent years that generations like mine and younger, for instance, talk a lot more about their mental health openly. But even not so long ago, that was all behind closed doors. And in the Philippines, it just seemed like every month I knew someone personally who was dying without health insurance, or losing a home to a natural disaster or a fire or a demolition like Nadine's home, and having to start from zero all over again. It just seemed constant every month. And I've lost count of the number of open casket funerals I've attended for infants and children sometimes because of things that we get here, cancer, things that are universal, sometimes diseases that are treatable and could have been avoided. And seeing that time and time again was so difficult for me. Now, in the Philippines, it shouldn't be too shocking. The population of the Philippines is more than 3 times the population of Canada. The Philippines is like a dot on the map compared to Canada. So that's another explanation why I'd be seeing death and pain more and more. And the poverty rate and mortality rate are much higher in the Philippines than they are here. So it wouldn't be a shock. Our economy, our healthcare does provide a bit more of a buffer. But what I want to say here is that nobody is completely protected from these realities, right? We're all going to face them. It will look different. Now, I'm talking about extremes. I'm talking about losing homes and losing family members, but even smaller things. What I observed is that my Filipino friends were much more accustomed to dealing with discomfort. I want to give an example. Sometimes we'll do these mission trips. Our center is in Manila, but we'll take our team to a rural province, to a church in a rural area, and we'll do a mission there. We'll do a DVBS, a Bible study for the kids. We'll do some things for the church there, maybe painting, repairing their church. And I would be the only non-Filipino. And these churches out in these rural areas, in the mountains, they wouldn't have beds. They wouldn't have rooms for all of us, for my big team. So most of the time we would sleep on the church floor, just this concrete floor. And my team would typically bring some mats, very thin mats. And my Filipino teammates, some of them would sleep on a thin mat. Some of them would sleep on the hard concrete floor, and they would sleep like a baby. And here I am. I thought I was so low maintenance. We grew up going camping. I'm an outdoorsman. I thought I was pretty low maintenance, and I realized I'm a princess. And I would sleep on, 2 or 3 of those thin mats and still not sleep for more than an hour. My back was hurting, and this is 20 years ago, or 15 years ago. So I was young, but I was actually jealous of them. I was envious that they could sleep like a baby on a concrete floor, but it's because they were so comfortable with discomfort. They were so accustomed to it. And if I get a headache, I'm saying, honey, can you get me a Tylenol as soon as possible? That's our culture in general. If we can, we try and buffer and protect ourselves from as much pain and discomfort as possible, don't we? And that is a luxury that we have. Now, these pictures are hard to show. And I want to share that I asked for permission from these families, the people in these photos, if I could show them while I preach. Because these are some of their lowest moments of their lives. And it's not it's not a competition. When I say my lowest moment doesn't compare to theirs, but it sure is true. These are pictures of families that we serve losing their homes to fires, to demolitions. In the bottom left, you'll see a boy with a black shirt. His name's Jassy. That's him watching his community after it was destroyed by a fire. 50 families, over 400 people lost their homes in that fire in a matter of 40, 45 minutes, the whole community, because most of their homes are just plywood, very simple materials, once a fire starts. And by God's grace, no one was seriously injured or killed, but they lost Jassy, and those families lost everything. They ran out so quickly, even the flip-flops they couldn't even save, ran out in their bare feet, so literally had the clothes on their back. Other pictures, the bottom right, that's Nadine's community. So she lived in a tent. Other people had 4 plywood walls, but you see the bottom right picture just demolished. That's when we came in and took photos after their community was demolished, and they lost their homes. In the bottom middle picture, the boy with his mother, that's Dave, was a sponsor child at our charity at IT Tender, and Dave died of leukemia at around age 6 or 7. And leukemia is something that can happen to any of us here. Of course, it's not specific to the Philippines. Now, after these tragedies, after families lost homes, lost family members, one thing I discovered about myself is that I don't have the words to say. I don't know what to say. First of all, I can't relate. I've never lost an immediate family, never. I've never lost a parent or a child. I've never lost a home. And so in most cases, I just sat with these people. And at IT Tender, while our focus is education, whenever there's a tragedy, we'll raise funds and we'll help provide new housing. Or we'll provide a livelihood, we'll help provide jobs so that they can pay rent at a new home. But also, what we've discovered is we've become so much closer with these families. After they go through tragedy, they realize that we're there for them. We realize that we don't see them as just a soul that we're trying to get in church. That's a big, important thing to us. We want them to be saved. But they also see, oh, John and his team care for our physical well-being on earth as well. Aside from our salvation, we care for both, right? So when they lose a home, when they lose all their clothing, we provide new clothing. We ask even our Filipino churches, do you have used clothing you can donate? And when we do those things, the incredible thing is our church attendance really goes up. They want to know, why would they be giving without asking anything in return? Why are they giving us food and housing without requiring us to attend the Bible study of the church? Why are they doing it with no strings attached? Who are these people? And we tell them it's God, it's not us. That's what we feel called to do. Sometimes in life, the pain and the trials and the suffering is just too great to carry alone. Again, I said pain and suffering is universal. It may be more behind closed doors here. We may not see it right out in the open, but I know that there's people here. I know there's people right now who are in pain, who are grieving, who are suffering, who are struggling. And when it's so great, sometimes you can't carry it on your own. What's so profound to me, now, we sure do try, especially in our culture, but what's so profound to me is when Jesus was carrying his cross up the hill, we know that Jesus was fully God, but also fully man. He came to the end of his rope, and he could no longer physically carry it. Do you remember that moment where even Jesus Christ, the Son of God, needed someone to carry his cross the rest of the way up the hill? And it wasn't even a friend. It wasn't even someone who knew Jesus. It was a stranger. It was a foreigner in their land. And the Roman guard said, hey, Jesus can't carry it anymore. You need to take his cross to this stranger. And he had to do that. That fascinates me because God could have lifted that cross a little bit higher on Jesus' shoulders, right? But he didn't. He let Jesus bear the full weight after he'd been tortured and in pain. This is the verse. It says in Luke chapter 23, verse 26, as they led Jesus away, they seized one, Simon of Cyrene, a foreigner, who was coming in from the country, and they laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. Sometimes the pain is too much for us to bear it alone. And I don't believe we're always called to. If even Jesus himself needed someone to take his cross and carry it the rest of the way, how much more do we? None of us we're adopted sons and daughters of God. We are very human. How much more we need someone to help us carry those burdens, right? Be it friends, family, be it a stranger, or, of course, God himself. Now, the next photos I want to share are photos of after those tragedies, after those fires, demolitions. Like I mentioned, although education is our focus, when you lose a home, right, all of a sudden education isn't priority number one, right? It's food and then shelter. Education is lower down the list. It's not one of the basic necessities. And so we make it a priority, and we'll provide in the top left, there's my staff preparing, canned goods and all sorts of goods, making these relief packs to give to families that lost their homes. In the bottom left, after one of Nadine's relatives, they lost a farm. They had a little bit of farmland near their tent. So we bought them all the materials they would need again. We bought her some farming materials to be able to farm again in a new place. In the top middle picture, this is a home that we helped the family start renting. So they lost their home in a fire. We said, we've got, the first few months of rent. And in the bottom middle picture, you see all these snacks. We helped them build a little convenience store in the front of their home so that they could sell snacks, sell different things to be able to afford rent. What's amazing is that the lives of many of these families actually got better. I would never wish a fire or a demolition upon anyone's home. But then they started living legally. They started renting. We helped them start a livelihood where they could earn some income, enough to pay rent. And so without that tragedy, they would still be squatting illegally. And in the bottom right picture, this is a new motorcycle that we bought for this man. So again, he lost his livelihood, lost his home, and with this motorcycle, he could do deliveries now and earn an income and pay rent. This man, actually, that's Nadine's father, with the motorcycle helmet on. And he was a drug dealer in their former community. So providing this new job also gave him a legal job and being able to rent legally. So God is good in spite of trials, in spite of the difficulties. Now, I want to share a story, and I could easily share a parable. I could share a story from the Bible, but my fear is that most of you have already heard every parable and most of the stories in the Bible, if not all of them. Okay? But the thing I love about parables and stories is they can help us to understand a kingdom principle or a concept about what heaven is like or what God is like. They can really help us get our minds around a very difficult principle, kingdom principle. For example, the last shall be first, right? Or give and you'll be blessed. These concepts are hard for us to understand as just as humans, our nature. But a parable can really shed light on it. But since you've heard most of the parables, I'm sure, what I want to share is a story from China. And this story it's more than 1,000 years old. And I believe that the principles in it, there's a biblical principle, a kingdom principle, that's hard to comprehend, hard to understand, but this story helps explain it a little bit. So the story, on the next slide, you'll see a farmer and his son. So this is in China over 1,000 years ago. This farmer and his son worked on a radish farm. They had this radish field. Now, they didn't own the land. They didn't own the property. So the owner of the property would let them farm on his land, and whatever they sold, the radishes they sold at the market, whatever income they made, they had to give most of it to the owner. So please understand, this is a very poor farmer and his son with no titles or property to their name. And they would work hard. The father is getting older now, so the son does most of the work. And one morning, the son was out working in the fields, in the radish fields, with their one and only workhorse. And the workhorse got spooked and just took off, hopped the fence, and ran up the hill beside their farm and beyond, and was not to be seen for quite a while. And that boy ran inside and said, Pa, we're in trouble. I don't know what we're going to do. The workhorse got spooked and just took off, and he's gone. How are we going to farm this land? It's going to take so much longer. It's going to be so much harder. And the father said, Son, I'm not sure if this is bad news or good news. I can't call it yet. And the son thinks, that's a odd response, but he just goes back outside and gets to work, toiling, and it's much harder to harvest these radishes. But then a few days later, the son hears a sound like thunder coming over the hillside, and he sees their workhorse running back down the hill, followed by 10 wild horses. And the son gets excited and amazed, and he runs and opens the gate, and all these wild horses come rushing in to their gate, and he slams the gate shut, runs inside right away and says, Pa, you're never going to believe this. We're never going to struggle again. We're no longer in the radish business. We're in the horse business. We're going to break and train these horses. We've got nothing to worry about. And the father is surprised, but he says, Son, I'm not sure if this is good news or bad news. I can't call it. So now the son thinks, okay, maybe my father's starting to lose his marbles a little bit, but whatever, I'm going to go out and I'm going to start training these horses. So the boy gets to work, and he starts trying to break and train these horses. And one day he's sitting on a wild horse. The horse bucks him off, kicks him off. He flies in the mud, lands in the mud, and to add insult to injury, the horse kicks him in the leg and shatters several bones in his leg. So the boy's screaming, hobbling on one leg into the house and says, Pa, I've got terrible news. I have no clue what I'm doing. I don't know how to break horses. And one of our horses kicked me in the leg. It's shattered. Now I'm useless. I can't even farm, let alone train these horses. So the father, there's no hospitals for miles. The father has some remedies. He puts the son in a chair, elevates his leg, gets some leaves that have healing properties, wraps them around his leg, and some various ointments. And the father says, Son, I don't know if this is bad news or good news. What happened to your leg? I can't call it. So you can imagine how frustrated the boy would be to hear that. Obviously, it's terrible news, what happened. But a couple days later, they hear the sound of thunder again, what sounds like thunder, coming from beyond the hillside, and there's this army of Chinese soldiers coming down to their house, led by an army general, all decorated in different colors, riding on their horses, all of them riding horseback. Hundreds, at least hundreds of horses come, and the general brings his horse right up to their front door. He hops off his horse, knocks on the door, and the father goes and answers the door. The general says, I'm sorry to disturb you, sir, but there's a civil war, and we need every young, fit, strong man to come and fight with our side. And the father opens the door a bit further and says, the only young man I have is my son, and look at him. He's broke his leg. There's no way that he can join your army and fight. And the general just says, I'm sorry, sir, sorry to waste your time. And they move on to the next farm. And that boy goes on to live another day, because what they find out very next day, after that army went to war, everyone on that side in that army was destroyed, was killed in battle. Now, why am I telling you this story? Many of us have heard of Romans chapter 8, 28. It's a very popular verse. I do believe that God can use any situation for the good of those that love him. That God can take a situation that's clearly bad news, that no one would wish upon anyone, and use it to bless his people and to bless others. And for me, the moral of that story is, it's not the end of the story. What happened when the workhorse ran away? That was clearly bad news, at least in the mind of the son. That wasn't the end of the story. The horse came back and brought more horses. What happened when the boy broke his leg? Obviously bad news. It wasn't the end of the story. It saved his life. Right? And we struggle. We think that everything's up against us. We think that either we have bad luck or we've done something wrong. Why do these bad things keep happening to us? Do you remember Nadine said, I always wondered, why me? It could have been anyone else, she said. Why did I have to grow up in this struggle? 1 in 3 children born in Manila are born below the poverty line, born in poverty. So if you were born in the Philippines, you have a 1 in 3 chance. Sorry, the Philippines, the whole country. You have a 1 in 3 chance of poverty. Why not us? Why Nadine? Why was she born to extreme poverty? Later in the video, she said, oh, now I know why. So God could show his power, that nothing is impossible with God. Amen. Praise God. Right? And for that father, the Chinese father in the story, we don't understand his thinking. We don't understand his reasoning. It sounds a little crazy, but he knows it's not the end of the story. Yes, this may seem like bad news, but it's not the end. God's still writing the story. You may feel like you're at the end. There may be times in your life, maybe right now, where you think, this is the end for me. God's not done with you. God's not done the story for your family, for this community, for this church. There may be times where you think, oh no, we're in trouble. The story is not over. It's still being written. And I want to share a few key points very quickly, just 3 key points. Number 1, when someone you know is in the midst of struggle and suffering, sometimes the best thing you can do is just be present with them, right? Just like my friend did for me when I was struggling. One of the most challenging stories in the Bible for me is the story of Job. If you know the story of Job, you know that Job lost everything. And if you read the story, it says so many times, Job was a good man. No one could say, although his friends did try and say, you must have sinned, you must have done something wrong. But the story tells us Job was a good man. But he lost his livestock, he lost his livelihood, right? He lost his home in a fire, he lost his children, all of his children died, and he lost his health. He got so sick, he had sores from head to foot, he got this disease, painful, horrible disease. And all the while that these things are happening to Job, Job keeps asking God, why? Why is this happening to me? And this is the most frustrating part of the story for me. God never actually answers his question. He doesn't answer it directly, at least. Job asks him many times. Job is having a direct conversation with God, and God is responding. But it reminds me of Jesus. When Jesus was asked the question, how many times did he come back with another question? Or he didn't answer it directly. It's no surprise that Jesus would have the same personality as God, of course. But God never answers him why. What God does say at the end of the story to Job is that he is all-powerful, that God can do all things, that he was there from the beginning of creation. And he also says that Job really has no right to demand answers from God. This is a hard one to swallow. I would never say that it's wrong to question God or ask why. Time and time again throughout the Bible, we see people asking God why. His closest followers asking him why. But God says, Job, you have no right to demand answers from me. Shouldn't it be the other way around? Right? Shouldn't you answer to me, not me answering to you and everything you want to know? Now, again, I don't think it's wrong to wrestle with God and ask him why. But I do think we need to expect that God may not give us the answer we want, or even an answer sometimes. That's the hard thing to swallow. But what God does tell Job is, trust me. You need to trust me. God assured Job of his power, his wisdom, and his love. Job learned the hard lesson that when everything is taken from our lives, when everything is taken, all we have is God. Is God enough? Amen. This is what God responded when Job repeatedly asked him, why? Why me? Why am I suffering? Why is this happening to me? Which a lot of us probably have asked before. God said, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Who made the sea? Who made the clouds? Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you? Here we are. God said, who has a claim against me that I must pay? Essentially, why do I need to answer to you? I'm God. Remember? Everything under heaven belongs to me. And Job finally stops questioning. And in the very end, Job humbly says, I'm convinced you can do anything and everything. And he decides to trust him. He doesn't turn his back on God or say, I'm going to spite God. His wife says, maybe you should just spite God. You're still talking to God? That's what his wife says. And his friends all say, it's because you sinned. That's why. You did something wrong. Job doesn't accept any of those answers. He wants an answer from God. And when he doesn't get the one he wants, when God tells him, hey, I'm all powerful. Remember who you're talking to. You answer to me, not the other way around. You got to trust me. What happens in the end of the story? Some of you know, most of you know, everything, his wealth, his health, now he can't get his children back. Some things that are lost are lost. It's still a tough story to swallow. But God gives them the ability to have more children again. And that shows me, sometimes we'll think, maybe God doesn't care about my life on this earth. Maybe it is all suffering and struggle and that's it. And then everything will be better in heaven. But I do believe God cares about our physical well-being. Why would he restore Job's health miraculously? Why would he give him wealth back? I do believe that God does care about our well-being on earth as well, physically. What's the next point I want to share? Number 2. Tough times do not automatically develop good character. Boy, I sure wish they did. I wish that struggles and suffering made us stronger every time, made us better. The reality is that trials and suffering can make you bitter, or they can make you stronger, right? They can make you more angry, or they can make you more empathetic. Now, when you go through pain and suffering, it's very natural, very normal to be angry and bitter, at least for a while. That's a normal human response, to get angry or to say why or to be bitter. But if you carry that more than a week, more than a month, more than a year, that bitterness doesn't just become an emotion, it becomes a personality trait, right? Or being angry, you start with being angry, you have an angry month, an angry year, and then you become an angry person, the last thing that we want to become. Or you can turn that around. God can help you transform it into compassion. There are so many people who've gone through unimaginable pain and suffering, maybe some of you here, and it's made you more compassionate in the end, because you can empathize with people in a way that I can't. In some cases, some people, when they go through suffering, they run away from God, right? In other cases, some run to God, right? You can block God out. You can have a lot more doubts when you're struggling. You can lose your faith. You can stop praying, stop talking to God. Or other people, it really depends on the person and the scenario. Other people will run to God and depend on God because they've got no one else to turn to. right? We all cope differently when it comes to suffering. Another thing that I found so profound about Jesus is when Jesus was on the cross at the very end of his rope, physically, mentally, spiritually, imagine going through all that suffering and hanging on the cross. What were Jesus' words? He said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is such a profound sentence, even theologians struggle with understanding it. Because again, Jesus, who was fully God but also fully human, felt separated from God and said, "Why have you, God, forsaken me?" So if even God, in his lowest moment of pain and suffering, felt a bit of a separation from God the Father, how much more us, who are people, who are human, when we suffer, if someone goes through a period where they say, "I can't talk to God right now," or I'm having serious doubts right now, I'm not going to judge them. Even God himself felt separated. Jesus on the cross felt separated from the Father. But we know that's not the end of the story. Of course, we know that he's seated on the throne in heaven. Everything belongs to him. It's not the end. Jesus dying is not the end. I remember a pastor in one of the rural provinces where we visited in the Philippines. We did a mission trip, and this pastor, him and his family would always swim in this river. And his little boy, around 6 years old, one day jumped into the river and didn't see just below the surface there was a large rock. He landed on his chest on this rock, and there's no hospital for miles, and he couldn't make it to a hospital, and he passed away, tragically. And this pastor said, "When my son died like that, I couldn't talk to God for months." A pastor. I couldn't pray. Now, I could say, "You're a pastor. Aren't you supposed to model that for us? Shouldn't you run to God? As a pastor, don't you have a direct line, a direct connection to God?" Well, not any more than all of us do, right? But of course I didn't think that. I thought, that is horrible. I can't relate. I've never lost a son or a daughter. But it made me think of Jesus on the cross. Even to himself saying, God, why have you forsaken me?" So if any of you feel that way, if any of you are going through such a dark time that you can't even talk to God, at least for a period, I don't judge that. I don't judge that. And of course, that pastor now is praying to God again, and he's pastoring a church, and he has a different empathy and compassion for people who's lost a child. He can connect in a way that I could never connect, a deeper way. Last point number 3. You need to go through tough situations in life to grow. Now again, I said tough situations, struggles, they don't automatically make you into a better person, but they are a prerequisite for you to grow and become a better person. It is required. If we never have any struggle and pain, we're not going to grow. Even Paul says, something's lacking. I would be lacking if I didn't have suffering. Something in his character would be lacking. Paul says in the next slide, Romans chapter 5, verses 3-4. We read this earlier. We also glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. The very last thing I want to say is that your pain and your struggle is not the end of your story, right? Hold on to that hope, and you may not get the answer you want from God. You may wrestle with him, but I pray and hope that you will learn to still trust him, wait on him, and hope in him. And the last quote I want to share is unfortunately going to sound like a Hallmark card. I'm going to say it anyways. Your trials become your testimony, and your misery becomes your ministry. What do I mean by that? Your trials become your testimony. Look at Nadine's testimony. What did she talk about? She talked about the struggles. Her testimony is so powerful because God brought her through some unimaginable struggle and poverty. Now, I'm not saying that every testimony has to have struggle to be powerful, but isn't that what we put in our testimony? When we share a testimony, whether we're going to be baptized or we just want to share with others, don't we include the hardest parts of our lives, the pain that we have overcome because of God, that we couldn't have done without him? And then lastly, I said your misery becomes your ministry. Look at the people who lead meetings for Celebrate Recovery, Alcoholics Anonymous, the people who sponsor people. Most of them are people who've struggled with substance abuse themselves or dependency themselves, right? Look at the people who lead meetings for others who are going through grief, others who've gone through a miscarriage. It tends to be people who've gone through it themselves, right? You can do that with anything in your life. What has been your misery? What has been your struggle? Turn it into your ministry. There's someone that's gone through something similar to what you've been through. And it's a blessing to them to have someone that can relate, maybe even just to sit with them. I pray that we can all do that. Again, thanks so much for having me and for listening. God bless you all.